They gave me the title before they gave me a window. Strategic xenologist, attached to the diplomatic fleet, advisory rank, required at every envoy council and none of the celebrations. In practice, a strategic xenologist is a cultural analyst who treats physics and ideology as the same weapon, reads energy policy like scripture, looks at a reactor configuration and tries to infer which neighboring civilization it was built to kill. The Federation uses people like me the way it uses guidance software. The Federation itself is a coalition of human and allied polities that turned war into resource allocation, with treaties layered like insulation around every high-output star. We export infrastructure, arbitration boards, shared power grids. In return, we get access and influence. Everyone repeats the line that large conflicts are behind us, that entropy belongs in textbooks, not in threat reports. The fleet was on approach to the border when Command pulled me off my models and up to the observation gallery. The gallery is the tiered chamber at the prow of the flagship, where admirals and envoys like to watch history without touching it. The room sits just beneath the primary sensor array, wrapped in composite and shield, with a wall that can show any spectrum we ask for. By the time I arrived, they had already tuned the displays to the contact system. The star hung at center, dimmer than it should have been. This primary was the object that had sent us the handshake pulse, the coded sequence that matched one of our standard templates for new civilizations. A new partner, Command believed, a new grid to stitch into the network. Admiral March stood with the Envoy Council at the front rail. He commanded the diplomatic armada, which in practice meant most days he refereed quarrels between captains and ambassadors. His uniform still carried the sharp lines of someone who had once commanded gunboats along contested borders, but his voice had softened into committee cadence. He crooked his fingers, calling me forward. I took a position a pace back from the rail where I could see the star and overlays without stepping into their hierarchy. The displays had scaled the system for human eyes. Orbital paths traced faint arcs. A translucent sphere marked the formal rendezvous zone, where the alien signal had invited us to wait. The star itself was the problem. On paper, it should have been in the stable middle of its life. The Federation's historical charts, pulled from old surveys and archive probes, showed normal output. The current readings drifted lower, cycle after cycle, as if some hidden hand had turned down a control. Sensors had laid a mesh of data across it. My console fed me numbers, gradients, field strengths. I let the figures roll through the back of my head and watched the shape form. A shell wrapped the star. The structure did not resemble the clean bubbles or smooth shrouds I knew from prior megaprojects. The construct showed as a layered swarm of panels and frames, hundreds of thousands of pieces locked into orbital families, each one catching radiation and routing it away. A star cage stripped to function. Where I would have expected habitat rings or station clusters, I saw only work platforms, service spines, transfer conduits. The assembly gave off nothing like the broad thermal signatures most projects of this scale leak. These usually glow in their own way, re-radiating what they capture. Here, the spectrum mapped as absence. Energy disappeared along vectors our instruments could not trace, like water poured into a crack in the floor. March leaned against the rail, fingers resting on the metal as if his hand could feel the shape in front of us. Efficient people, he observed. He used that word the way other people use righteous. Envoy Marek eased closer beside him. Marek chaired the Contact Council, the small board of diplomats tasked with making first impressions. He wore his formal sash and the kind of polite half-smile that never quite reached his eyes. Post-scarcity industry, Marek concluded. Why spend cycles on ornament when you can bring half a system under control? I let their thoughts run a little longer while I watched the charts, the live feed of stellar output, the traces of motion on the shell. Then I lifted my slate. They're starving the star, I said. That much needed no caveat. Marek turned his head. Clearly, they've built an energy envelope. They're probably redirecting most of it to deep sinks, maybe to support a distributed habitat farther out. We're only seeing the conversion layer. They're pushing it down its life cycle early. I brought up the overlay of historic flux versus present values. Light curves from decades ago pulled from old surveys. Light curves from today dipping like a patient's chart. Output has dropped beyond what shell interception alone explains, I went on. Internal structure is skewed. Convection patterns are being forced into tidy channels. They're accelerating its decline. The science officer at the lower station shifted in his harness. He ran the astrophysical models for the bridge and preferred stars to people. "You're assuming intent," he objected. "I always assume intent," I answered. "That's my assignment." March watched the star in silence. Marek lifted his hand for more data. I brought up the traffic plot. The system read as purely industrial. No loose cargo trains or family habitats drifted through the lanes. No heat blooms from farms or recreation clusters. Only heavy work structures pivoted along the shell in slow, regular sweeps. A few needle-thin probes stitched in on long arcs from farther out. "Nothing here looks like population," I pointed out. "Only infrastructure." Marek raised his brows. They could keep their people farther away. A culture that treats its power source as a project might find crowded orbits disrespectful. "Possible," I allowed. Their reply signals carry the same pattern. The handshake had started simple, an answer ping in the expected band. Then it widened into a structured stream. They had accepted our primer packet, the code we send to any new contact. They had adapted their language modules, matched key reference points. That part followed doctrine. The content diverged. "Compression ratio sits exactly at a wasteful balance," I explained. "They bleed energy in the link. Their first messages arrive wrapped in redundant noise." Marek frowned. "Low compression usually tracks with early development. They may just be inefficient. They're tuning the channel to the point where waste is maximized without collapse. They throw power away on purpose." March shifted his stance. "Your read." "I see only work structures on the shell," I said. "No thermal spill, no habitation signatures. Constructs with one clear function: absorb and dissipate. Communication that deliberately prefers loss over clarity. Stellar evolution forced into a steep descent. My working hypothesis is that this culture treats decay as policy, maybe even a central value." "Entropy worship," Marek murmured. "Something in that direction." I nodded. He adjusted his sash, smoothing a crease only he seemed to notice. "Every civilization begins with some reverence for change. They may have simply taken it farther. We will talk. We'll find a way to frame this." March turned his attention back to the navigation data. "Protocol stands. We hold at the rendezvous, we show hands open, we meet them above their own structure. Federation First Contact doctrine begins with trust. We present ourselves near the edge of a partner's system, in sight but outside weapon range. We offer power links, data libraries, non-interference guarantees. The Federation believes generosity on entry costs less than conflict later." "Your presence will be required," Marek told me. "Cognitive analyst attached to the delegation. We'll need you to read them on the rib level." I nodded once. I didn't bother to pretend I had any choice. You don't attach a strategic xenologist to a flagship and then leave him at his desk when the fleet meets something like this. Below us, the star's light shifted another fraction. The shell's dark plates drifted, adjusting. Each new alignment trimmed a little more from the glare reaching our instruments. I watched the arc of the shell slide across the star until the bright edge narrowed. It felt less like the start of a conversation and more like the last act of a ceremony, a shutter closing at the end of a rite someone had begun long before we arrived. The shuttle they chose for the first descent wore more diplomacy than armor. Its skin gleamed with the Federation crest, nested circles that stand for shared orbits and balanced exchange. The hull could take a glancing strike, but its most prominent feature was the transparent blister at the nose, so envoys could look impressed at alien vistas. We launched from the flagship under formal protocols, a line of escort craft holding polite distance. Inside, the envoy team sealed their pressure skins and ran through last checks. Marek rehearsed greeting phrases in the compact measured register that translation suites handle best. Other delegates muttered through their own scripts. A medical officer checked her field kits. A compact figure with short hair and a manner that brooked no nonsense. Fleet medics hold lives in their hands and know it. I strapped in beside the sensor console. The pilot kept her hands light on the controls. "Approach vector locked," she reported. "Target platform has opened a dock." The alien shell filled the forward blister. Up close, the constructs that had looked like a smooth envelope from a distance resolved into a scattered forest of frames and plates. Each panel drank light. It didn't bounce, scatter, or flare. It vanished, as if the surface led somewhere indifferent to reflection. Our instruments strained as we crossed the boundary of the shell's influence. Resolution blurred, fine detail on our screens dulled. The math looked as though someone had smoothed a hand across it. "Field interference," the sensor tech muttered, fingers flicking controls. "Some kind of surface layer that saps contrast." "They build their structures to erase their own outline," I noted. "Visibility becomes another gradient they flatten." The dock that had opened for us protruded from one of the larger frames. It formed a ring of support arms wrapped around a recessed pocket. As we closed, the dock's edges shifted, like rock under a tide that changed its mind. Material crumbled away in slow, continuous flow. The pieces didn't drift. They thinned into a fine, particulate haze, then settled back into new shapes. Our magnetic clamps scraped along that changing edge. The pilot swore under her breath and feathered thrust to keep us from grinding through. "They're letting their own structure erode while we dock," she muttered. "That's either indifference or a test." "Record everything," I said. "Rate of loss, reformation pattern. This may be their idea of maintenance." The clamps finally found purchase on a hardened lip. The docking tunnel extended with a slow mechanical step, each segment forming as the previous one decayed into it. By the time the seal indicator lit green, the tunnel behind it already looked exhausted. Inside the shell, the corridors had the sagging look of things built to surrender. Metal panels bowed inward between their supports. Insulating foams had collapsed into powder that clung in drifts along the bases of the walls. Conduits hung from brackets no one had bothered to straighten. At each junction, faint indicators glowed as small, steady points marking the route. Nothing flared or pulsed. The guidance looked like a series of patient decisions. "They build to operate amid failure," I observed. "Systems keep working while structure falls away. That's an aesthetic as much as an engineering choice." We walked in a column, boots leaving clear tracks in the powder. The medical officer kept her case close, glancing at the panel strapped to her forearm. Marek walked at the front with a diplomatic guard to either side. I drifted in the middle, making notes. We reached a chamber that widened around us like a hollowed organ. There the hosts waited. They approached along raised walkways spiraling down from the upper levels. Each moved on mechanical limbs, jointed in ways that mimicked biology without obeying it. Their bodies were assemblies of parts from multiple sources. One had a human frame from pelvis to shoulders, bones stripped of skin and reinforced with struts and cables. The skull perched above didn't belong to that skeleton. It came from some scaled creature, elongated, with metal rings gripping the bone like a harness. Dark orbs sat where eyes had once been, smooth as polished stone, fibers running back into a machine pack. The mouth moved out of sync with the words that reached us. "Visitors," the voice announced in our own trade tongue. "We come under requested truce. You named a meeting. We attend." The translation suite's timbre echoed from the chest cavity, where speakers had been sunk among the ribs. The voice carried the calm tone of someone reading from a manual. Marek stepped forward and set his boots behind the painted line that marked formal distance. The line had appeared as we approached, bleeding out of the floor's material as if the shell itself had grown it. A gesture of protocol from hosts who treat the physical substrate as something to be rewritten at will. "We acknowledge your presence and your response," Marek began. He had practiced this introduction for weeks. "We are agents of the Federation, a coalition of multiple species and polities joined in mutual aid and coordinated development. We come to offer contact, exchange, and non-interference." He lifted a hand in the open-palmed gesture that signals trust in our tradition. The translation system mapped it to the alien channel, a packet of posture data their systems could interpret. The lead construct tipped its skull fractionally. "We receive your names," the chess speakers responded. "We recognize your scale. You are the Bright Order, the Gradient Hoarders." Marek allowed himself a brief breath through his nose. "We call ourselves the Federation. We manage power to avoid destruction. We favor stability." "The Bright Order," the construct repeated. "You maintain towers of difference, temperatures, potentials, flows. You fear arrival at rest. You fear the true end." The words carried only observation. Another construct joined the first. This one used the spinal column of some large quadruped as its central beam, with human arms bolted along it like an afterthought. One of those arms flexed, fingers scraping the walkway and leaving thin streaks. "Our designation in your frame is Congregation of Final Temperature," the second construct announced. "A closer description in your terms would be those who tend the fading. We assist the universe in reaching uniform rest." Congregation of Final Temperature, an organization built around ultimate thermodynamic equilibrium, treating the decay of gradients as communal duty. A congregation is a group bound by shared worship. Their worship centered on the final temperature at which no work can be drawn. Marek held his composure. He had stood in front of warlords who decorated command decks with trophies. He had negotiated with machine collectives that spoke only in throughput metrics. "You intervene in your star's evolution," he observed. "We're eager to learn how and why. We would welcome joint study." Joint study is the phrase for technology sharing under monitoring. "Our star is being eased," the first construct replied. "Its struggle shortens. We return its fuel to rest on a timeline that avoids waste. Harm does not arise." The medical officer shifted her weight beside me. I kept my gaze on the hosts. "In our framework," I said, "a star that lives its natural span supports vast numbers of lives, cultures, works. Patterns rise and fall on top of the thermal flow. We see value in that complexity." "Disease," the second construct answered. "Agitation, transient eddies that delay the sea." The first construct gestured with one mechanical hand. Its preserved human fingers flexed with care, tendons long since replaced. "You invited us," it went on. "You broadcast from your network of stars. Your message carried maps of many gradients, many lamps, many tumors. We recognized an obligation." Marek's attention sharpened. "We sent contact templates," he said, "standard maps, to show where we live." "You called healers," the construct replied. "We come to treat the inflammation." "Treatment," I said, watching the stars feed on my wrist display, still wrapped in the dark shell. "You shorten lives. You flatten potentials. You name that care." "We remove strain," the construct answered. "All systems end at rest. You know this. You delay. You hoard. You build fields and walls to hold away the night. That is cruelty. We correct it." Marek took a fraction of a step closer. "Our mission is to prevent suffering," he countered. "We invest energy so sentient beings don't die in storms or darkness. We intervene when gradients are exploited for harm. You intervene to keep the difference," the second construct replied. Your treatments extend tension. That is the cruelty. Every configuration that can fall and does not is a stretched nerve. They spoke as if outlining farm policy. We would like access to your surveys, the first construct added. You have mapped the structures you bind, stars in your core volumes, machines you build around them. Share these and we can prioritize care. We can ease your worst inflammations first. You're asking for star catalogs, Marek clarified. Positions of our habitable systems. We request knowledge of where you maintain the strongest gradients, the chest speakers answered. We will list them by contribution to final rest. Behind Marek, one of the guards shifted, hand near his weapon. Permission to carry arms had been contentious in council. In the end, Marek had insisted that arriving armed would read better to any culture that respected force. We can certainly exchange data, Marek replied, without committing to content. We also have much to offer. Techniques to stabilize extreme environments without collapse, methods to manage entropy locally while preserving broader balance. We can learn from each other. That lies outside our wish, the first construct answered. Learning is agitation. Agitation delays. We carry complete doctrine. I stepped in by half a pace, where the translation suites could catch my voice cleanly. You built this shell alone? I asked. No client species, vassals, dependents? Those phrases carry assumptions that do not apply, the construct answered. We have received offerings from many cultures. We have incorporated their works. We have adjusted them toward proper function. They rest. Rest, I repeated. The word lay between us like a lid on a grave. Marek pulled the conversation back toward procedure. He offered membership in the Federation's arbitration forums, access to shared archives, structured observation missions. The hosts declined each offer with quiet courtesy. They never discussed rewards. They held to their work. When Marek wrapped his formal speech with the line about mutual understanding, the first construct inclined its head. We are grateful you called, it told us. Your network is dense, your accumulations large, illness in your volume is severe. You have given us necessary responsibility. The chess speakers carried the translation into our ears with no trace of menace. That made little difference. We were on our way back to the shuttle when the star changed. The platform under our boots trembled, a low mechanical shudder that ran along the walkways and into the supports. Emergency glyphs sprang up on the walls, a quick stutter of symbols our suites flagged as something between warning and chant. The lead construct halted, its skull tipped back toward the ceiling, dark orbs turning to track some signal we could not see. Is there a problem with your structure? Marek asked, keeping his tone neutral. Treatment begins, the construct replied. Observation will help you. You require clarity. The chamber's inner wall thinned, material flowing aside. A new opening formed, looking out through a transparent barrier into space. The star filled that cut. Its surface, what we could see between shell plates, had shifted. Granulation that once showed as chaotic, roiling islands now lined up in orderly bands. Streams of plasma funneled into narrow corridors leading directly into dark receiver arrays on the shell. At those points, faint halos formed as fields engaged, channeling energy inward. Our suit feeds chimed. Stellar output dropped in smooth, sharp steps, like someone turning a dial in discrete clicks. Gravitational profile changing. The sensor tech warned through the shuttle link. External field is being forced, not following normal collapse curves. On the platforms beyond the viewport, modules unfolded like petals in reverse. Structures that had hung dormant rotated into alignment, focusing on the star. Where their beams struck, outer layers of plasma sagged, depriving their own turbulence of fuel. Marek lifted his arm to his cuff. All ships, stand by for rapid extraction. The pilot's voice came back, edges crisp. Docking clamps are responding slowly. Structure under us keeps shifting. The construct beside us stayed in place. "This is sacrament," it told us. "You should witness. Few outside the congregation see the work at this point." The medical officer watched the star. Her slate displayed survival estimates for Federation personnel on the scattered research platforms we had dropped in orbit farther out, the ones we had set up quickly to record the contact event. The numbers fell. Each station depended on power links from the star. As flux fell, buffers drained. "Those installations will fail," she observed. "There are people on them." "Agitated patterns," the construct replied. "They will rest. You practice such interventions yourselves. You burn fuel to keep them from this outcome. That is your cruelty. This is release." In the viewport, one of the small outposts changed, not with heat but with structural collapse. The shell had swept a field across it. The field's signature registered as a distortion in local bonding ratios. Metal frames slumped, losing crystalline order. Polymeric components fell into granular states. Organic material collapsed into dull residue that drifted from restraints. Telemetry from the outpost cut off. "Docking clamps frozen," the pilot reported. "The platform is letting itself fall apart at the attachment points. The mechanisms we lock to have crumbled. The debris has jammed our latches. We're fouled in the grit." Marek drew himself up. "Release any way you can, now." Panels in the floor near the viewport slid aside. Sections folded back like lids. Beneath them lay ranks of forms, host bodies, mummified flesh stretched over frames. Some had clearly begun as humans taken apart and reassembled. Others bore remnants of other anatomies, extra joints, additional limbs, chitin plates integrated into metal. Each body had been wired into a grid of conductors. Thin filaments ran from exposed spinal cords into the floor. Readouts on my wrists spiked. "Residual neural activity," I reported. "Minimal but present. These nervous systems contribute to the field control." The medical officer fixed on one human face in the row. The skin had receded from the teeth, lips stiff and cracked. The eyes no longer contained fluid, yet faint charge flickered across buried sensors behind them. "You have people alive down there," she protested. "We retain patterns as long as they serve," the construct replied. "They offered themselves. They are honored. Their dissolution aligns with the work." Marek turned on it. "You're committing an act of war." "We perform care," the construct answered. "Your definitions of war rely on boundaries, belts, flags. Our category differs." The platform lurched. The pilot cursed in our ears. "I am cutting loose. Hold on to something." The docking tunnel tore. Material that had tried to crumble for us now sheared in jagged planes. Panels broke away in slabs. The shuttle's nose dipped as free space opened where the dock had been. The pilot slammed directional thrust. The shuttle's flank scraped along a fragment of the platform's edge. One envoy lost footing and slid. A guard snagged his harness and hauled him clear. Powder and shards spun through the air outside the viewport. We shoved into the shuttle's lock in a tangle of boots and elbows. The medical officer swung her case ahead of her, shielding it as if it were another passenger. Marek gripped the handrail with white-knuckled hands. The last diplomat in line turned to look back. He had been the most vocal optimist about this mission, the one who had spoken in council about the chance to show a truly alien culture the benefits of shared infrastructure. A stray strand of field cut across the lock as he moved. I saw it as a shimmer in the air, a thin plane where the image behind it stretched. He passed through that plane with one shoulder. For a heartbeat, he remained whole. Then the exposed half of his body changed. Skin dulled, color drained into something like dry clay. Fine structure in muscle and tissue softened. Along the boundary where the field had passed, texture shifted abruptly. The transformed half of his torso crumbled inward. It didn't fall in chunks, it relaxed, as if some binding had let go. He folded sideways. The unaltered half of his expression held confusion. The altered half could no longer move. As he collapsed, the modified tissue spread, the boundary between parts crawling across him in a slow wave. By the time he reached the floor, most of him had become a loose, fine residue that clung to the deck in a fading stain. The medical officer reached toward him, then stopped a hand's width away. Her instruments showed nothing left to stabilize, no circulation, no cellular response. The material that had been a person now registered as inert. The shuttle broke free of the platform. The pilot hauled us out and around, engines straining against the changing field. Our escorts fell in alongside, formation ragged. One distant craft failed to match the abrupt curvature shift in local space. Its frame buckled, sections losing alignment, components drifting apart as if weary of cohesion. The star at the shell's center continued its forced descent. Internal layers folded inward ahead of schedule. Fusion zones shifted. Calculations that should have stretched across millions of years slammed into the present in minutes. Signals from our research stations flickered, then vanished. The last snippet from one relay carried an image of a crew in their control room, screens dim, backup systems dying one by one. The man at the panel looked at the camera, then down, hands moving in a pattern that might have been a farewell or simply habit. Admiral March met us in the shuttle bay. His security detail ringed the landing pad. Medical teams waited at the edge of the line with gurneys and kits. Marek walked down the ramp with the diplomat's residue dried to his boots. The medical officer followed, face pulled tight. I stepped into the bay with my slate clamped to my chest, data feed still streaming. March took in the team, the missing figure, the streak along the inner hatch. Report. Marek skipped the usual framing. They just killed a star in front of us to make a point, he answered. They invited us to watch. March's gaze flicked to me. They see our power infrastructure as disease, I told him. They frame their interventions as medicine. In their doctrine, this wasn't an attack on us. It was a demonstration of care. That doesn't make it less lethal. Demonstration is still force, March replied. They destroyed Federation assets. They killed our people. They shortened a star's life. He turned toward the bay intercom pickup. Fleet, he called. We face entropic assault by the entity designating itself Congregation of Final Temperature. This constitutes hostile action. All ships shift to war posture. Alarms rolled through the decks. I stayed where I was, slate pressed against me, watching the updates. Behind us, the star collapsed into a new configuration no myth from home had ever bothered to name. The shell plates adjusted, tracing the shift like hands smoothing a blanket over a patient. Inside my head, models scratched for space. I still wanted to understand them. My mind reached reflexively for the possibility that this could be contained through framing, doctrinal channeling, some negotiated exception. That reflex would define everything that followed. We withdrew along a curve that kept our engines pointed away from the worst of the changing gravity. The Armada regrouped at a far station, a system the fleet used for repairs and resupply during long missions. The support world there held few civilians beyond the workers who kept the docks and farms running. It sat on the outskirts of Federation space, built for staging rather than living. The time between the star's collapse and our arrival at that fallback point blurred into damage reports and emergency councils. We counted ships lost to field distortions, lives cut off when hull beams aged into uselessness, and SEALs no longer believed in their own function. By the time the fleet settled into new orbits, a wider pattern had emerged. Congregation vessels moved like a scythe along the border. They showed no interest in garrisons or governance. After each operation, they left behind only decaying infrastructures and anchored constructs, then passed on. One report summarized a colony's last day. The world had been a water planet in a stable orbit around a young sun. Mild seasons, generous power from orbital collectors. Generations had gone into bringing that system into balance. When the congregation arrived, they left the planet's surface untouched by bombardment. Instead, they bracketed the star with construct rings and began their ritual work. Within hours, the sun's output dropped beyond forecast variance. Shields above the colony's cities drained their stores. The sea's surface began to glaze. Harvest towers stalled mid-cycle. Machinery designed for fluctuations faltered, then stilled, caught in positions that showed how much time they had expected. Another packet carried footage from a transit corridor. Transit gates are large structures that bend space to permit fast travel between linked points. They rely on sharp gradients, concentrated energies, carefully maintained stresses. The congregation treats those as tumors. In the footage, a gate that had served as a hub for several trade lines sagged. Circulators lost alignment. Containment fields guiding warps degraded in uniform fashion, not through catastrophic failure, but through a deliberate easing of tension. The gate slumped into disuse as if surrendering its role, internal stresses bleeding away into a dull equilibrium. They left constructs in every system they touched. Some wrapped stars, others sat in orbit like altars, feeding on residual gradients. Each one maintained decay. None offered shelter. Our analysts crowded the war room. The war room on the flagship had originally been built as a planning theatre for logistics, a hollow around which officers could gather to argue over cargo flow and aid routes. It now carried layers of defensive overlays, stars lit as points. Lines marked former shipping routes. New patterns traced congregation moves. We had managed to pry open part of their communications net. Their channels travelled along tight beams mapped to their own field flows. Our cryptographers had found enough structure to pass basic content. It did not read like command chatter. It read like liturgy. The messages took the form of schedules, sequences of targets, each annotated with a value for its contribution to some overall entropy measure. Each action carried a notation for how much it advanced their desired outcome. They treated objectives as solved math. They checked each other's calculations. We watched one burst in translation. Star designations filled a ranked list. At the summit sat a bright, massive primary with multiple industrialized worlds. Below it, a string of lesser suns feeding transit networks and research chains. Each line carried a projected impact score. At the bottom of the slate, a phrase rendered into our tongue as a blessing. May all gradients fall without remainder. Their weaponry kept its character. Beams reached across space and undermined structure in whatever they touched instead of burning it, coaxing orderly matter towards simpler states. Zones where time and bonding ratios diverged made some places age faster, while others refused to change. Defense grids built around kinetic and thermal threats had little to bite. My team and I worked through the nights, mapping their path. Patterns emerged. They moved along the outer reaches first, hitting systems heavy on high-energy installations, but light on population. Outer mining rings, research nodes, transit hubs. Projected lines converged on the core of Federation volume, where the densest networks lay. On the screens, their course looked like a set of concentric scars closing over a target. Yet gaps cut through that picture. Here, I pointed during one council session, zooming the display into a narrow arc beyond the intermediate regions. They skip these coordinates. Their lists ignore them. Their beams bend around them. Entire clusters along this band remain untouched. The band held multiple dwarf stars, old and faint. Dwarfs are ancient, low-mass stars, condensed into compact bodies that burn their fuel slowly over vast spans. These dwarfs sat in a deliberate curve, as if some hand had placed them carefully. "They aren't worth the bother," one admiral argued. "Low output, low infrastructure, no colonies. Why waste tools on embers?" "They vanish from their language," I answered. "Every other star gets a notation, even low on their priority chart. These don't appear. Something has masked them out of the frame." The science officer brought up a density map. The dwarf arc stood out as a thin, unusual strand. Their combined gravity tugged at nearby space in a peculiar way, as if holding something taut. "Could be a natural feature," someone offered. "Could be a boundary," I countered. "Some older structure, something they serve, or something they avoid." Fear felt like a strange word for a culture that treated stars as livestock to be euthanized. Still, zealots collect taboos. March watched my display with narrowed eyes. "What are you suggesting?" "We need to know what that band is," I answered. "If the congregation avoids it, then either it holds something they revere or something they want sealed. Either way, it matters." Marek leaned back, hands folded. "Our immediate concern is keeping them out of our dense volumes," he reminded us. "Defense first." "Defense built on ignorance collapses," I replied. "We cannot build counters without understanding their absences as well as their strikes." Argument followed. Some urged concentration on fortifying key stars, shaping new fields to blunt entropic attacks. Others, mostly from the exploratory corps, pressed for more information. In the end, the solution followed a familiar pattern. Officially, the fleet poured resources into shields and redundancy. Unofficially, March authorized a reconnaissance mission. A small strike group would jump into a system already under congregation treatment. The aim: steal technology, map fields from the inside, and if possible, capture a piece of their apparatus. I volunteered before March finished outlining the plan. He didn't look surprised. "You understand the risk," he remarked. "Understanding their doctrine from sensor feeds and intercepted chants will not be enough," I answered. "We need to see how they build, where they anchor their rituals, how they bind matter to their accountancy. That takes someone on site who reads culture in machinery." Marek watched me from across the table. "Your last brush with their ritual cost lives," he reminded me. "You pushed for proximity then too. You still carry one of our people on your shoes." "My shoes were already clean when I came in here," I replied. "We washed the deck." Small, petty truth. March weighed us both, then inclined his head toward me. "You'll go as analyst," he decided. "You will defer to tactical command on withdrawal. We will not lose another shuttle because you wanted one more reading." I accepted. The desire to understand and the duty to keep people alive had shifted into open collision. That tension would never truly resolve. I walked out of the council chamber with the recon slate already ticking down to deployment, my role sealed by my own insistence. The target system lay along one of the congregation's fresher wounds. Our scouts had picked up their constructs wrapping a star there, but the process had not yet completed. That gave us a slim chance to slip in before the ritual fully locked down. The strike group traveled under field cover, masking its profile as rubble from prior engagements. Our hull carried a rough coating of broken metal and fused slag slotted into supports, a disguise meant to confuse automated watchers at first glance. On entry, the view ahead looked like a clinic taken over by zealots. The star had been reshaped. Its surface patterns stretched into long, rigid lanes. The shell around it had grown thicker on one side, where a dominant ring of monoliths hung like a chain of teeth. Each monolith was a vast block, matte and jagged, with docking points for smaller craft and anchor arms reaching inward toward the star. We chose one of the mid-sized structures, a block that seemed to house control equipment rather than bulk processing. Our approach vector hugged the trace of a field line, following a path our models thought would minimize exposure. As we closed, stray shapes spun past. Bodies drifted in slow loops, caught in stable orbits around the ring. Some still wore fragments of suits from other species. Others had been altered, limbs stiffened with rods, torsos opened and held that way for inspection. "Those are offerings," I observed. "They collect victims as part of the ritual. They might count them." The mission commander, Terran, a compact man who had spent his career in fast attack craft, kept his eyes on guidance. "Our task is to steal a piece of their altar and get out," he answered. "We can argue theology later." We latched onto the monolith at a recess that looked like a maintenance channel. The surface beneath our clamps carried a rough texture, like weathered stone, but when our tools bit into it, it responded with controlled resistance, substance yielding where fields permitted. Inside, the monolith felt like an inverted cold engine. corridors angled downward in slow spirals. Our suit heaters pushed against an ambient temperature that sloped toward null. We passed alcoves as we went. Each recess held a specimen. One niche held a torso sliced from some broad-bodied creature, perhaps aquatic in origin, now suspended upright in a transparent block. Vessels and nerves had been teased out and threaded into surrounding conduits. Each connection carried faint current, like an instrument played very softly. Another recess held a ring of mechanical parts from different cultures wired into a common bus. Federation plating sat beside panels from machine collectives we had once fought. Each piece had been stripped of its context, markings scratched away. They had become components in a new equation. "Account books," I murmured. "They catalogue what they unmake." Terran cast me a brief look over his shoulder. "You can annotate later." The core chamber lay at the bottom of the spiral. It opened around us like the hollow inside a machine, with ribs reaching inward to hold a central device. The central construct dominated the space. An inverted tree of generators and rings reached inward toward a region that contained no obvious matter, only a localized distortion. Our instruments barely coped. Metrics that normally sat still began to wander. "Their main tool sits there," one of the engineers whispered. "They're carving at the vacuum baseline." The vacuum baseline is the set of properties we normally treat as constant. The energy of empty space, the ratios that decide how particles behave. To push a star into a different life path, you don't need to shove every atom. You can adjust the frame they move in. Around the central device, input arrays formed a ring. Each array consisted of a surface covered in sockets. Artifacts filled most of them, weapons from captured fleets, data cores, religious totems, bits of sculpture, even what looked like a child's toy, a spinning ring from some lost world. "You were right," Terran muttered. "Accountancy. Every pattern they lay down gets tallied." In one recess, the device drew on more direct material. A figure hung suspended in a tangle of supports, flesh and machine intertwined. The original body might have been human once. The proportions matched, though the limbs had been lengthened. Tubes ran into bone, cables sank into spine. The face still carried remnants of form, cheeks fallen in, lips drawn back. Behind dull eyes, sensors tracked us with the slow focus of something stretched thin across a long service. Stan, the security officer with us, stopped. He had come up through dockyard fights and border skirmishes. His responses tended toward direct action. "What did they do to him?" Stan muttered. The figure's fingers twitched at the sound, or perhaps at the movement of our bodies. His gaze shifted from Terran to Stan to me. Each motion took effort. The readings on my slate showed whatever consciousness remained operating far below normal human rate. Time passed differently for him, drawn out. "He's part of the control loop," I said. "They use his perception as another gauge, a conscience wired into the device." Stan lifted his rifle. "Stand down!" Terran snapped. Stan kept the weapon up. "That's a Federation uniform," he hissed. "They carved up our own and stuck him into their machine. We're not leaving him like that." I opened my mouth to argue, then closed it. Terran hesitated. The figure's eyes met Stan's and held there, a thin lock of attention with no clear message. "If you're going to act," I told Stan, "make it clean. Do not touch the arrays. His neural net feeds the device. A stray spike into that thing could tear more than this room." Stan focused on the point where supports met the back of the figure's neck. He adjusted his aim. The shot took the target exactly where he intended. The upper spine shattered. The cables sunk into the vertebrae, tore free. The body sagged in its harness. For a heartbeat, everything in the chamber paused. Then the central device shifted. Fields around the distorted core surged. Readings on my slate jumped into regimes our software treated as abstract. Rings flexed. The controlled adjustment of the star outside lurched. Terran swore. "You just kicked their altar. Brace for backlash." The floor aged under us. Cracks traced out between my boots and the central device in branching networks. Those lines deepened. The support ribs along the walls took on the same pattern. Centuries of stress landed on them in a breath. Other parts of the chamber froze. A panel sagging halfway from its mount snapped back into perfect rigidity, its deformation arrested. A tool dropped by some technician during earlier work hung in mid-fall, no longer moving. Time had become uneven, parceled out in patches. One engineer tried to step back from a widening crack. Her left leg moved, her right did not. Field readings spiked around her knee. The limb that refused to respond began to blur at the edges as molecular structure lost track of itself. She toppled sideways. By the time she hit the ground, that leg had turned into something like packed dust, unable to bear her weight. Her screams stuttered when the same field tangled with the motor pathways controlling her throat. "Extraction," Terran ordered. "We have what we came for. We cut and run." We had used specialized clamps to start detaching a segment of the central device. That segment now hung half free, some lines still tying it to the core. I looked at it and saw an entire branch of their doctrine encoded in its arrangement. The way they shaped field gradients through it would tell us how they counted decay. It could give us a way to misalign their rituals. We could leave it and escape more easily, or take it and lose more people. The fragment is the point of the mission, I argued. Without it, everything we risked here buys us only views. Terran glared. Every heartbeat we stay in this room costs lives. Every star they ease costs more, I answered. I pushed past him to the control interface for the clamps. My slate linked in. The harness arms that had begun to retract paused, then moved back toward the fragment under my commands. "You'll lose people if you stay," Terran warned. "I know," I replied. "I have seen the projections." I locked out his override. The harness arms bit down on the fragment's supports. The fragment twisted, resisting. Fields fought fields. The distortion at the core surged, then flickered. One ring of the device vanished, leaving a scar in the air where it had been. The engineer on the floor clawed at her own thigh. Her fingers passed through material that no longer believed in solidity. It parted and flowed around them like dry dust. Her breath came in rough pulls that no pattern training had prepared me to pass. Another crew member, a tech raised on industrial habitats who believed she had seen every way machinery could fail, reached for a fallen unit. The local field treated her hand differently from her arm. Her fingers shrank, wrinkles carving into the skin as if a lifetime had been dropped into them at once. Bones thinned. By the time she jerked back, her hand no longer matched the rest of her body. It hung at the end of her wrist, like something rescued from a grave. The harness tore the fragment free. The core device flared, instruments recording a spike in metrics with no convenient metaphor. Outside, the star responded. Its surface convulsed. Patterns forced into clean lines broke into knots, then snapped into a new, harsher order. Terran dragged the engineer with the altered hand toward the exit. Stan hoisted the half-collapsed colleague, leg leaving a trail of residue. I shoved the fragment ahead of me on a slick of field we barely understood. We ran up the spiral, while the monolith folded into its own decline. Panels peeled from the walls, supports finally giving up. Sections of corridor ahead stiffened into fragile blocks that shattered at a touch. Behind us, entire stretches fell away, the framework skipping to a state that no longer supported strain. At the dock, our shuttle pilot had already burned half her reserves, keeping our clamps attached. The monolith had tried to shed us like a scab. We loaded the fragment into the cargo bay. Terran pushed the wounded in after it. The engineer with the ruined leg dragged herself the last span, teeth bared as she hauled the dead weight of a limb that no longer obeyed. The pilot cut us free before the hatch fully sealed. Pressure equalization slammed through the cabin as we fell away. Rear cameras caught the monolith twisting. The incomplete core device flared a final time. Then the interior collapsed inward, mass sliding into a more compact configuration our instruments struggled to classify. We did nothing that could save the star. Our interference only changed the shape of its fall. As we cleared the ring, the star's light shifted into a hue outside its prior classification. Outer layers had been stripped too quickly. New reactions kindled in unstable patterns. A flare of field reached out from it along lines the congregation favored. On the cabin screens, one distant congregation craft turned its profile toward us. For a moment, I thought they would pursue. Instead, it altered course toward the wounded monolith. They would rebuild their altar and adjust their calculations to account for our theft. Our sensor tech, pale and sweating, watched the intercept net. "Their transmissions just surged," he reported. "Patterns consistent with satisfaction. They're logging this as a successful sacrament with added complexity. Our theft, our dead, our partial victory, acceptable variance within their plan. Another step towards their goal." I strapped myself into a cradle, the fragment secured behind me in its cage. I had chosen to spend human lives to gain this peace. I clung to the belief that the data carved into its structure would justify that choice. Justification would come later. The dead did not get to wait and check whether the numbers balanced. The fragment sat in a containment field on the flagship's secure deck. We built a cage around it from our best isolation materials, layering fields and barriers. Engineers and physicists crowded the viewing bays. Security stood in a ring beyond them, weapons ready, as if bullets meant anything to an object that altered binding energies. I watched from the main console, slate tied into analysis streams. The fragment's internal geometry carried a familiarity that sent a shiver through older parts of my mind. Field paths, small adjustments in vacuum parameters steering immense flows, nested feedback loops that ensured the device's own decay contributed to its function. Each feature mirrored research I had done years before. Before the Federation had given me a desk and a title, I had worked in the Black Programs wing of its Strategic Science Bureau. That bureau handles projects deemed too dangerous or useful for open circulation. My focus had been theoretical tools for managing entropic weapons, ways to steer destructive gradients without losing control. One project had involved a test. We designed a device to alter a minor star's evolution, forcing it to collapse early in a controlled way. The idea, sold as deterrence, ran simple: demonstrate to a hostile neighbor that the Federation could erase an asset if pushed, thereby preventing war. The test took place in a remote cluster, far from inhabited worlds. The chosen star fed no colonies. The project had failed, or so the official report claimed. The probe we sent into the test region returned incoherent data, then went silent. The field was deemed unstable. The program went into archive. Now, staring at the congregation fragment, I recognized design choices we thought unique to our own work. I pulled clearance strings. Crisis unlocks doors that remain barred in peace. The attack had given me new access. I used those codes to dive into the Bureau's files, tracing the test through layers of classification. The report read like a lesson in evasion. The project description matched my memory. The stated goal matched what I had been told. The failure summary, however, danced around specifics, talking about non-conforming field behavior and instrument saturation, without naming what had been observed. Raw data packets lay behind the summary. I pulled them, slotted them into my slate, and let them unfold. The probe's last clear images showed a star wrapped in a frame of devices that had started as ours. Then, frame by frame, new structures appeared. They did not match any Federation design scheme. They attached themselves to our devices like barnacles, then spread. The final frames showed constructs not unlike the congregation's current monoliths, though rougher. Prototypes. A first congregation forming around our weapon. Logs that followed documented a familiar pattern. Communications from the test region adopted a distinct tone, referring to gradients and rest with almost religious cadence. Our bureau had tried to interact, then severed contact when it became clear that whatever we had awakened did not share our priorities. "We built them," I murmured, alone in the secure alcove. "We put the first instrument in their hands." The next council session ran hot. News had already reached March through his channels. Marek arrived with a look that could have scorched stone. "You knew," I accused, ignoring hierarchy for a breath. "Your office signed off on that test. You buried it when it grew into this." March met my stare with the weariness of someone who had carried a burden for a long time. "We believed the region lost," he acknowledged. "The test taught us the tool was too dangerous. We sealed the files. We believed nothing coherent survived to use it." "You created a doctrine that treats our entire grid as sickness," I pressed. "You handed them the frame. They added scripture." Marek cut in, eyes sharp. "Those choices were made under war pressure. The enemy we faced would have burned half our border if we hadn't shown capacity to strike back. People believed a surgical star collapse would prevent worse." "You didn't just show capacity," I said. "You made a faith out of it. They inherited your proof of concept and decided you hadn't been thorough enough." We all looked at the fragment in its cage. It hummed in a silent register, fields turning over in a slow metronome. "So we share guilt," March concluded. "That does not change our next steps." We had two broad options for the fragment's use. The Defense Bureau had begun sketching a scheme to adapt its principles into a protective crust around core Federation regions. The idea: create a layer of controlled high-energy conditions that would make tampering costly for the congregation. We would build our own shell around our heartland, manipulating baseline properties in a way that favored our stability. The risk sat in detail. A misstep in calibration could trap our own stars in precarious states, balanced on edges that small perturbations might tip. The other possibility did not appear in official plans. I kept it in my own slate, written tight. The dwarf arc the congregation avoided matched the region around the old test site. Those dwarf stars had not always been dwarfs. Their arrangement bore the mark of engineering. Someone had turned them into anchors. Anchors here are objects designed to pin properties of space in place. They serve as clamps on the vacuum baseline, holding constant steady where they might otherwise drift. The fragment responded strongly to simulated conditions matching those anchors. Its field equations hummed in resonance when I fed it those numbers. I saw an opening. If we trigger this fragment at one of those dwarfs, I argued in a smaller private session with March, we might wake whatever sits under their clamps. The congregation treats that region as taboo. They fear meddling there. If we loosen the anchor, we create a threat they cannot ignore. They divert attention away from us to deal with it. March stared at me as if I'd proposed cutting open his chest to examine his heart. "You want to tamper with constants in a region that already holds an unknown hazard," he said. "You want to do that on purpose." "I want to shift where the risk falls," I answered. "Right now, their path leads straight to our core. A defensive crust might hold for a while, or it might trap us in a fortress while they refine a counter. If we open a wound they care about more than us, we change the equation. You're suggesting we create something worse. I'm suggesting we wake something they feared enough to ring with anchors," I replied. "They or whoever built this network. Someone else scarred that region. We can pretend it will stay sealed, or we can use it." Marek watched me with something between pity and disgust. "You're starting to sound like them," he said, "treating entire regions as levers, talking in gradients and wounds. Where did that line go in your head?" "The line moved the first time we built a device like this," I answered. "We just refused to admit it." March shook his head. "We stay with defense," he ruled. "We tear the fragment apart for shielding. We do not pull on a lock someone else placed on the universe. I won't sign another order that leaves that kind of scar." His decision became part of the record. It did not quiet the pattern in my mind. I spent the next cycles in analysis suites, tracing field lines through the fragment, plotting how small changes in anchor states would propagate. I watched simulations of the dwarf arc with clamps weakened, shifted, broken. Each run produced a different wound. I slept in snatches at my station, head on folded arms, slate still lit. Support staff began leaving food within reach, then withdrew without comment. A quiet certainty grew in me. It didn't feel noble. It felt like an infection using my training as its root. If we relied only on defense, the congregation would keep easing stars. They would keep cutting off worlds. Their doctrine had no room for negotiation. We had seen how they treated trade framing. They wanted no bargains. The only tool that offered a chance at shifting their focus lay in that taboo arc. The more I stared at the maps, the more those anchors looked like an emergency brace someone before us had installed to contain something dangerous. The congregation's paths bent around it like light around a lens. I copied the fragment's key parameters to a private slate. I encrypted them twice, then a third time out of habit. I loaded route data to the dwarf arc into a side channel. I requested a research vessel allocation under the pretext of deploying sensor buoys along the outer frontier. The system approved the requisition. In crisis, paperwork moves faster. On departure day, I signed the manifest, boarded, and watched the docks recede through the viewport. My official orders sent us toward harmless coordinates. My private course bent us toward the arc I was forbidden to touch. I knew, as the jump drive spooled, that I was stepping over a line. I crossed anyway. The jump dropped us into a region that felt wrong before instruments finished settling. Stars ahead traced a curve so smooth it might have been drawn by an engineer, not blind gravity. Each dwarf glowed with steady, dim light, surfaces an even spread of dull fire. Structures wrapped them. The structures were old. You can tell age in space not by stains, but by design language. Devices around these dwarfs bore patterns matching nothing in Federation archives. Frames curved along axes we do not favor. Control nodes used principles that made our sensors mutter and adjust. Each dwarf sat at the center of a cage built to hold, not harvest. Field lines arced between anchor points, forming a web that sank deep into the surrounding fabric. The congregation's own constructs kept their distance. Small black monolith ships skirted the outer edges, trajectories bending away as if repelled. The crew gathered in the main observation hub. They were mostly scientists and navigators who had signed on expecting to drop buoys and collect data, not step into a theological minefield. They trusted my reputation as someone who could read alien motives and keep them alive. "It's beautiful," one of the younger analysts murmured, staring at the perfect curve of dwarf suns. "Beauty isn't pertinent," an older physicist beside him muttered. "Those anchors clamp around something we haven't named." I brought up the fragment's model and overlaid its preferred field domains on the map. Lines lit up along the arc. Every anchor resonated with its structure. "The fragment likes this," I said. "It recognizes home ground. Whoever built these clamps thought the way we thought when we made it." The captain, Lewis, quiet and long-serving in research traffic, watched the overlays. "You diverted us from our assigned route," he said. "This isn't the buoy corridor." "No," I answered. "This matters more." He wore no sidearm. On a research ship, captains rely on authority. He folded his hands behind his back. "Explain." So I did. I laid out the fragment's history, the buried test, the awakening of the congregation, the taboo arc, the anchors, the proposal I had brought to March and Marek, and their refusal. I showed projections of congregation advance under pure defense. System after system dimming. Shells wrapping stars that had hosted festivals. Then I showed the alternate model. If we triggered the fragment here, at one anchor, The dwarf arc would shift. A new wound would open. A region where baseline properties drifted faster than anywhere else. Congregation doctrine would mark it as both crime and calling. They would divert forces to address it. Their expansion toward our core would slow, perhaps bend. "You want to open that wound yourself," Lewis concluded. "Yes." "And you brought us here under false orders to do it." "Yes." Each crew member weighed their own stakes. One navigator, lean and tense, stepped forward. "My sister lives on a farm station near one of the projected paths," he said. "Under your first model, congregation tools reach her in a handful of years. Under your wound model, they turn aside. She lives longer." A scientist crossed her arms. "You're trading one horror for another," she objected. "You want to alter baseline in a region already holding something dangerous. We have no idea where that front will run." "We know where their current front runs," I countered. "Straight through our densest populations. I'm not offering a good option. I'm offering one with a different target." Murmurs spread. Some had family in the core. Others had already lost people in earlier collapses. Some flinched at touching constants. Others at leaving them untested. Lewis watched them, then me. "I should turn us around," he said. "Bring you back in irons. Let a tribunal sort your intent from obsession." "You can," I allowed. "If you do, we go home, build our crust, hope it holds. The congregation keeps going until it either breaks against our defenses or erases enough of us that the question becomes academic, or we do something that makes them cry out." He held my gaze, then looked down through the transparent floor at the fragment's cage. Its fields glinted faintly where our containment met its own. "I will not order my crew to help this," he decided, "but I'll not stop them if they choose. Anyone who wishes to assist can stay. Anyone who refuses will go into stasis until we're done, then serve as witness at my court-martial." The room split cleanly. A cluster of volunteers stayed near me. The navigator with the sister in danger, the young analyst who had called the Ark beautiful, an engineer who had lost a partner on an early station collapse and now saw the congregation's roots as a map of graves. Others stepped back. A senior physicist walked to the door without a word. Another followed. The medical officer, a lined woman with careful hands, paused, then joined them. Lewis logged their choices. He keyed the stasis bay and began cycling those who refused into pods, where they would sleep through what came. In the control hub, we set to work. We maneuvered into position near one anchor. The dwarf star glowed with muted light. Its cage of ancient structures bristled with devices we did not recognize. Field readings showed a stable hold on local properties. We lowered the fragment toward it on a tether of controlled force. Our containment couldn't fully block interaction. That was the point. We wanted it to taste the anchor's state. As the fragment approached, instruments woke. Values we usually treat as constants began to show small variations. The speed of light in the immediate vicinity ticked down by tiny increments. Couplings between forces shifted by fractions so minute they would only matter over vast spans, until the fragment amplified them. "Engaging link," I announced. I keyed the final command. The fragment reached outward. Fields formed between it and the anchor structures, not along ordinary lines but deeper channels. The dwarf star's interior responded. Its core, once a quiet ember, compressed. Anchors creaked in field terms, clamps flexing. On our screens, space near the star darkened in more than light. Processes that rely on specific balances began to sag. Particle interactions that had been stable started to favor outcomes that shed energy faster. The dwarf shrank. It folded inward, turning into a more compact object whose mass remained, but whose behavior changed. The ancient anchors adjusted, trying to compensate. Their efforts propagated along the arc, tugging neighboring dwarves. A front formed. It rolled outward from the altered anchor, not as a blast but as a slow wave of changed baseline. Where it passed, laws shifted slightly. Some bonds became easier to break, others grew stubborn. Over vast distances, that front meant stars would age faster, gradients would fall sooner, patterns would find less secure footing. Our ship sat near the edge of the first rise. Hardware began to misbehave. Displays fuzzed, not from signal noise but because circuit materials no longer behaved as their designers expected. Timing protocols slipped. Clocks based on precise oscillations drifted. The hull, built to flex within known tolerances, responded oddly to stress. Spots designed to give stayed rigid. Others relaxed dangerously. In the observation hub, the volunteers gripped consoles. "This will reach beyond any map we own," the young analyst whispered. "Yes," I answered. The congregation noticed. Their intercept net lit. Transmissions flared across the channels we monitored. Content, once measured and liturgical, sharpened. They named the new phenomenon with a phrase our modules rendered as the wound that skips the prayer. To them, each eased star follows ceremony. Chant, alignment, sacrament, release. This region had jumped ahead. It moved toward rest without their guidance. It offended their sense of order and thrilled their mission. They began redirecting units. Our monitors tracked craft peeling away from current operations. Partial maps showed clusters of congregation vessels rolling toward the dwarf arc from multiple directions. Their liturgical schedules rewrote themselves, slotting the wound at the top and demoting other targets. Our core volumes, for a time, dropped down their priority charts. One volunteer let out a ragged exhale. He looked almost sick with the mix of relief and horror. "My sister gets more years," he murmured. "Many will," I said. The older physicists' recorded protest from the tribunal simulations would later echo in my head. Many others will not. Our ship creaked. The front had reached us more fully. Panels along the walls changed behavior. Fasteners that normally held at certain loads began to slide earlier. The jump drive's control framework flickered in the readouts, coherence fraying at the edges. "We should leave," Lewis said. "We may already be too deep," an engineer answered, eyes on the drive status. Before we could test that, the strike group arrived. Federation ships dropped out of jump at the region's edge. They made no attempt at concealment. They came in loud, transponders live, drive signatures clear. March had sent them to retrieve me. Their profiles pushed through the altered space with effort. Hulls built for unmodified properties showed strain in the way their wakes bent. They moved into a containment posture around us, fields overlapping to compensate for the new front. One vessel extended a hard dock toward our port side. Lewis stood in the hub, shoulders squared. He met my gaze. "You knew this might happen," he observed. "I hoped they wouldn't track us here quickly," I admitted. That hope was unearned. Security teams boarded. They wore full armor, harnesses tuned to resist both mechanical and entropic threats. Their commander stepped into the hub, visor up but stance rigid. "You're under arrest for unauthorized use of strategic assets, diversion of fleet resources, and triggering uncontrolled field events," he told me. I didn't argue. Nothing I could say would alter the ledger he carried. Lewis stepped between us for a heartbeat. "My crew acted under my command," he said. "Record that." "It's recorded," the commander replied. They bound my hands, more for form than effect. Real control lay in who owned the ships. As they led me toward the dock, a new transmission arrived. It hit our hull directly, tagged with identifiers we'd learned to associate with congregation core nodes. Our translation suites caught it and turned it into text before security cut the channel. It addressed me by name. "We have seen your work," it read. "You have taken what your bright order built and used it without their blessing. You have opened a path that moves more swiftly toward rest. You are midwife and traitor both. Midwife, one who assists in birth. Traitor, one who betrays their own." They thanked me. The message closed with a phrase that translated, with difficulty, as acknowledgement of an ally who did not share doctrine but furthered it. Security scrubbed the feed. They sealed my slate. They marched me onto the flagship. March did not meet me in person. His face appeared on a secure screen during interrogation. "You've altered the map of what is possible," he said. "We'll spend generations paying for it." "The alternative would have been to pay with those generations themselves," I answered. "Do not dress this as altruism," he replied. "You are as enamored of large moves as they are. You saw a lever and pulled." He was not wrong. They chose not to execute me. Execution would have been straightforward and would have satisfied some. It also would have thrown away a resource the Federation now considered necessary. The tribunal sat in a secure chamber on a quiet orbital platform. The platform circled a marginal star far from major routes. Its only purpose: hold things the Federation didn't want near anything fragile. Judges came from multiple branches: military, diplomatic, scientific, legal. Each had reasons to despise or admire what I had done. During the hearings, new data poured in from the wound. The front I had opened expanded slowly but steadily outward into the intergalactic medium, a tide of altered properties. So far it flowed mostly through empty space. Where it brushed small, cold structures, it changed little. Where it intersected complex arrangements, it began to nibble at assumptions. Congregation structures along the arc dove into the wound like priests rushing to an accident. They built apparatus larger than anything we had seen, wrapping the wound's core in constructs, perhaps to guide it, study it, worship it. Their advance toward our core slowed. They redeployed. Some fronts froze as they stripped assets to feed their work at the wound. Others continued with fewer resources. Federation worlds enjoyed a reprieve, not safety, but time. Time to build defenses, relocate some populations, accept loss in some regions to hold others. We quietly abandoned fringe colonies. Maps that had once shown a proud spread of bright points now carried patches labeled with quiet terms: decommissioned, redirected, surrendered. Opinions on my act split. One judge called me a cosmic vandal, a man who had carved his initials into the laws of reality. Another admitted, in a private session, that his models suggested core world casualties would already be mounting without the wound's distraction. They fashioned a compromise true to their nature. They could not leave me free. They could not afford to discard me. They bound me in a position that served their needs and emphasized my stain. They installed me as a liaison. The congregation had begun addressing transmissions to me specifically. They treated me as a colleague. Not an equal, perhaps, but someone whose choices they recognized. The Federation decided to use that. My cell on the platform was small and functional. Bed, desk, a slit of window to the outside where the marginal star burned without drama. Guards rotated through shifts at the end of the corridor. When they needed me, they brought me to a briefing chamber one level down. That chamber held a table with embedded displays. Maps of Federation space occupied the walls, overlaid with congregation paths and wound expansion fronts. Another bank of screens showed the wound itself, as best our distant instruments could track it. A bruise on the sky where stars and matter and rule sets slid faster toward dull sameness. Commanders and analysts sat across from me. None wore uniform in there. They dressed in plain clothes, as if that softened anything. "We need to steer them," March's replacement said in one session. March had stepped down eventually, his career burned out by what he had overseen. "They're asking you for maps, star surveys, historical data on our infrastructure. They want to prioritize their care," I noted. "Yes," the new admiral agreed. "We cannot stop them from treating you as correspondent. We can shape what you hand them. Each list you send can draw them away from some regions and toward others." They wanted me to choose. Give the congregation targets that would pull them from core populated zones. Feed them gradient-rich regions with fewer lives. Offer stars the Federation had already begun to write off. "You're asking me to aim them," I said. "We're asking you to buy time," the Admiral replied. You created this relationship, now you will use it. They wired the communication line into the chamber. Messages from the congregation flowed through a filter that let me see content but blocked anything leaving without explicit approval. Each message began with formal greeting. They titled me Steward of the Wound. They asked for guidance. Where did the order still burn brightest? Which of my people clung most fiercely to gradients? Where should they focus care? I answered with partial truth. I sent surveys of regions where the Federation had already pulled citizens back. I highlighted stars whose dimming would hurt us least. I omitted core corridors. I reframed history to make some dense zones look quieter. Each list delivered lives. Every star I marked had outposts, research stations, shell worlds. People who had chosen cheaper land or more solitude. We could have evacuated all of them if we'd started earlier. We had not. Now we shifted some. Others we left because resources never stretch as far as slogans claim. My cell walls filled with paper maps. They let me have paper. Screens are easier to monitor. Paper resists. I traced routes with pencil, crossed out lines, drew rings around places I refused to name to the congregation. Dark blotches spread where their shells closed. The wound at the edge swelled. The bright arc of worlds I still knew by name narrowed into a fragile curve. Guards passed my door on schedule. Some glanced in with flat eyes. Others kept their gaze on the corridor. None said more than duty required. To them, I was the man whose choices let their families live a little longer at someone else's expense. Tribunal observers returned periodically to check their decision. "Do you feel remorse?" one asked. An older man from the legal corps, a career spent parsing language. "My feelings don't touch the maps," I answered. "Remorse cannot put a star's fuel back." "That isn't an answer. It is the only one that matters." He wrote something in his file and left. The marginal star outside my window burned on, unremarkable. No congregation shell wrapped it. It held no place on my maps. Too small, too unimportant for anyone's doctrine yet. In the briefing chamber, the screens told different stories. On one display, a sector where the congregation had recently completed a sacrament lay dim. Ships we had stationed there glided out of frame, carrying evacuees and leaving behind infrastructures that would never function under the new baseline. On another, a defensive crust we had built around a core star held. Congregation beams scattered against it, fields failing to find purchase. For now, that star shone. The wound's feed showed an expanse where laws themselves had grown lazy. Structures there slumped instead of shattering. Complex cycles flattened and lost their rhythms instead of crashing. Congregation apparatus sat at the center, tending a phenomenon they had not chosen but now cherished. In front of those screens, I worked. On one particular cycle, they brought me again to the chamber. The guards took up their posts by the door. On the table waited fresh data. A new request from the congregation, wrapped in formal gratitude. "We require guidance," it read. "The fruits of your earlier maps have ripened. Many gradients have been eased. We would know where your order still burns brightest, so we may focus care." The Admiral stood beside my chair. "We've marked a set of outer systems," he told me. "Uninhabited now, but slated for expansion. If we give them these, we shepherd them away from current populations. That buys decades, perhaps more." Uninhabited now did not mean empty. I picked up the stylus and began selecting coordinates. My hand moved in small, neat strokes. Routine. That was the worst part. I circled a chain of stars along the far edge of the mapped void. Their potential fascinated our planners. Their sacrifice would hurt our descendants more than us. Beside each, I wrote brief descriptions framed in terms I knew the congregation found compelling. High gradients, dense networks, rich fields. When I finished, I set the stylus down. The Admiral watched the list, lips compressed. "No one will thank you," he remarked. "I'm not doing it for thanks," I replied. "You're doing it because you can't stop." he said. I didn't argue. We sent the packet. Somewhere across the dark, congregation receivers caught it. They would fold it into their liturgy. They would bless the new path. They would call me steward and midwife again. Back in my cell, I looked at the map board. Dark regions spread in irregular blotches, each set of marks the product of many hands, including mine. The wound at the edge expanded, swollen by structures and rituals I would never fully grasp. Between them, the surviving bright arc of worlds I still knew narrowed into a bow. My life had narrowed with it. I was no longer the analyst who looked at a reactor and guessed who might die. I had become the man who listed where deaths would come easiest. I had tried to bargain with a faith that worships endings, using trade. I had tried to frighten that faith with a deeper catastrophe. Both moves had given it more ground to sanctify. All that remained was this, choosing which lights dim sooner, so others can burn a little longer. On the board, I traced that remaining arc with my finger, following each star I had not yet surrendered. I knew their histories, their disputes, their habits, the patterns of life that still clung to their gradients. Outside, the marginal star continued its quiet fusion. Far beyond the charts on my wall, the wound I had opened spread another fraction, drawing the universe a little closer to the rest the congregation craved. I stood there in my cell, watching my own pattern of marks tighten around the bright places, and understood I would keep drawing until either my hand failed or there were no more lights left to choose between.